Hey everyone, Cynics here. It's time for more anatomy quick tips. Today I'm going to be going over hands, the feet of the arms. This one will be a little different than the rest. Hands are incredibly versatile, so I am going to try to give more actual quick tips during this video. It's also a good time to remind everyone that this video series focuses on skills that will help you be able to render believable anatomy from imagination. There are certainly plenty of other resources around the net that go far more in-depth on life drawing and reference anatomy stuff, but I like to share my own personal thoughts and notes when it comes to rendering that stuff without reference. Anyway, let's get into it. I'm going to start by going over the basic structure of things. I don't know if you've ever taken the time to count, but each hand should have roughly 5 fingers. I'll make a simple drawing here of both the front and the back of the hand. I have a tendency to stylize the fingers as being a little bit extra narrow, but I'll try to explain more of that later. Just don't panic too much. Like I said, every drawing in these videos is from imagination, so it's only accurate up to my ability. The first thing I want to reiterate is my opinion on the importance of angular shapes when drawing organic forms. Aside from the more obvious differences, one important detail to note when drawing a specific side of the hand is the overlap of the finger lines with the webbing between them. When looking at the palm of the hand, the webbing will flow straight into the fingers. On the opposite side of the hand, it's nice to let the finger lines run past the silhouette a bit. Hopefully you can see what I mean with this little drawing up here. One other amusing trick for showing the difference between each side of the hands comes from the early days of animation. You may notice that Mickey Mouse and many other classic characters often have gloved hands, and these gloves often have a few lines down the back side. These lines are meant to evoke the idea of tendons and offer a quick visual cue to show which side of the hand you are looking at. Personally, I usually just use the fleshiness of the thumb to show the different sides of the hand in the roughest fashion. It's important to know that the palm side of the hand can be divided up into 2 main fleshy mounds, the obvious one on the thumb side and a narrower one on the pinky side. Try to avoid ever drawing the palm as just a flat surface, and remember to include those little hills and curves. I do have some more handy structural notes, so let's just clear up some space and draw another basic hand. It's often overlooked when starting out, but one thing you should always know about the hands is that the fingers naturally fan out slightly. You can make them stick straight out of the palm, but that is not a resting state. This can become increasingly relevant if you ever want to draw a hand that is curled up into a fist or gripping anything. Since the tangents of the fingers are naturally structurally fanned outward, this means that curling them up will result in them pointing slightly inward toward the center line of the hand. So, if you ever need to curl up a pinky or index finger, just remember that it will always skew toward the center of the palm. Next up, I want to briefly diagram the differences between the more structural and more fleshy areas of the hand. You may also notice again how the tendons fan outward toward the primary knuckle of each finger. It should also be considered that the primary joint for the thumb is not the one located off into the side of the webbing, but instead located right up against the wrist. Using this mindset will also help improve your understanding of other mammal anatomy and creature design. You can see how it looks a little more animal-like before you add the more human traits. Anyway, for our human hands, I like to remember that even from the back, you should be able to see a little bit of the soft fleshiness peeking out on the pinky side of the hand. It's also good to note the large amount of fleshy webbing between the thumb and the index finger. If you make a tight fist, all of this flesh doesn't simply vanish from existence, but instead forms a bit of a compacted lump on the thumb side of the back of the hand. This all sounds very convoluted and confusing to describe, so hopefully you can just look at the drawings here on the page and understand what I'm talking about. You can see that compacted fleshy lump on the far right there, circled in green with a little fleshy label. Alright, that's it for the structure stuff I wanted to mention, so let's simplify ourselves into the land of reductions. I already mentioned the diamond knuckles and the Mickey Mouse gloves, so I'm not going to go over those again, but I am going to dive into the digital world of fingers. So there are 2 main philosophies I like to associate with stylizing fingers. We have tapers and we have frogs. Tapers are what you will see me personally using in most of my own drawings. I approach every single finger like a slightly tapering box. There's no real trick to it, I just enjoy the way it looks. Each finger is just a long narrow box getting smaller as you go farther out. It seems to work well enough and certainly fits my taste for using angles in organic drawing. The second style I will mention is the frog style, and I just call it that because the fingertips and joints are slightly exaggerated to be extra large and round. You know, it kind of looks like a frog or something. Anyway, I'm not the best at this style, but I definitely see a lot of good artists use it really well. My examples here aren't the best, but they both have merits, and I hope this whole thing doesn't send you into some phalangeal crisis. Just remember, the answer for you might be something in between the two, or something completely different altogether. I just wanted to give you a couple style ideas to play around with. Let's move on to some hyper reductions. When it comes to doing quick gestures of hands or impressionistic thumbnails, I find it best to think about the hands in terms of triangles. Everything is triangles. It doesn't matter where the triangles are or how they're used. Don't focus on every section of the hand being represented by the same triangle every time. Instead, just try to be a bit abstract and energetic. Be like Phil Jackson. Just trust in the triangle and everything will work out. If your gesture hands don't look like children's origami, then you're putting in too much thought and effort. Alright, it's finally time to move on to the actual quick tips for drawing hands. They're more like fingertips, actually. Tip 1 is about spacing. I think some people might find this slightly questionable, but I love to space out the fingers as much as possible. It's a common mistake for beginning artists to group the fingers too closely together with no gap between them. It will feel cramped and the fingers will be devoid of any emotional quality. When they're spaced far apart, it allows for a much stronger sense of balance and emotion. I'm going completely overboard with it, so I'll try to dial it back a bit to show some slightly more realistic examples. The occasional gap here and there can add an incredible amount of personality to your hands. Drawing hands has gotten a bad rap, but once you appreciate their emotive qualities, I think you will find yourself enjoying them a lot more. Tip number 2 is going to be flow. Whenever possible, I like to attempt to have a sense of progressive motion through the fingers. Usually just letting the index finger lead the action and then letting the other fingers follow at a decaying rate. This is why, even though the index finger is shorter than the middle finger, I love to represent it as being slightly longer in a lot of situations. That's certainly another questionable decision, but I like it. Anyway, there is definitely a natural reason for this flow of fingers. Both the webbing between the fingers and the tendons themselves tend to create a natural pull on surrounding fingers. You should avoid drawing hands that have both fully extended and fully curled fingers positioned right next to each other. It's just extremely unappealing, and you can't really see the tension being caused by the surrounding fingers. I guess that's about it for flow. I hope it's a little bit self-explanatory. Just try to think of the fingers like a bird wing or something if you're struggling. If that makes any sense, I hope it does. Alright, tip number 3 is all about them West Coast hands. I don't know how many of you follow the popular fandoms, but middle finger and ring finger are definitely a thing. It's my ship. When casually posing the hands, you may find that they like to move together and cling together a bit more naturally than any of the other fingers. It may just be personal preference, but I also just think it looks really good to stick them together. No matter what the pose may be, you can add a little bit of personality by bringing those central fingers together. You might be noticing that a lot of stylistic choices are grounded in the exaggeration of often ignored features of realism. Pulling the ring finger and middle finger close together helps add emphasis to the fanning out of the pinky and index fingers that I talked about earlier when I was going over structure. I always like to find the hidden meanings in all of these appealing style choices. Tip number 4 is our last tip of the day, and this one is all about the pinky. Pinkies can be pretty useless overall, and like a lot of useless things, they compensate for this by being extra flashy. Pinkies are just too cool to hang out with the rest of the fingers, so if anyone is going to break the flow of the fingers and make it work, it's going to be the pinky. It can be super subtle or as extreme as a dried up creek, but it's always something to consider when drawing expressive hands. I find it works best on characters that have a very twisted or tense personality, maybe a bit eccentric, either that or British men drinking tea. Okay, that's going to do it for the tips. I'm going to just have a bit of fun now and try to render out some various hands from off the top of my head. I will do my best to get a nice variety of poses and angles. I don't have any extreme foreshortening going on with any of these hands, but I'll try to at least move some of the fingers toward and away from camera. Making really good fingers going toward camera or having extreme foreshortening could probably be an entire video on its own. This hand on the right over here has a silly long thumb, and I briefly considered fixing it, but it started growing on me. I think that's about it for the drawing, so when it comes to adding color, I'm sticking with my most recent adaptation and changing the line color to something very saturated. This just helps prevent things from getting dirty looking when the pixels start getting smushed around by all of these painter brushes. It also seems to have just sped up my painting process a lot. Anyway, the next step is background and base colors. As with every Anatomy Quick Tips video, I'm putting the warm skin tones against the cool and desaturated background color to make them pop a little better. I didn't use a huge variety of skin tones for these because I was feeling a bit lazy with the painting process. I've been in a very sketch-heavy mood the past week, so I'm going to just cheat my way through a lot of this rendering process as much as I can. It's mostly the same standard stuff, using the dry brush and painter to cut hard edges on one side of a form and blend it out in the other direction. In the most basic form, I like to gradient the hands to get somewhat more red as they go out toward the edges of the fingers. To be more refined, it's important that you make the last joint of each finger have a much deeper red tone. Aside from that, let's see, the palm side of the hand is usually a lighter pinkish tone compared to the rest of the hand. And of course the knuckles and other joints where the bones are pressed into the skin can be shown with lighter values. But be aware that they might also be surrounded by more reddish colors if the area faces a lot of wear and tear. Halfway through, I decided to lower the overall saturation on everything a bit. This will allow me to place in highlights and other areas with more deliberate saturation. And speaking of highlights, since I already mentioned my rendering laziness, I'm going to just use strong lighting effects as a shortcut for making things look finished. It's a great trick. This top one is going to have some direct overexposed light cast across it, but for the right one, I think I will place the light behind the hand and just use the rim lighting effects to make it pretty. A red glow will also be enough to simulate some subsurface scattering when used on specific parts, the fingertips and thinner areas especially. Now that hand on the bottom right was looking kind of bland, so I did put in a bit more effort on that. I had ignored the webbing between the thumb and index finger completely, so that needed a lot of work. I don't think I actually executed it ideally, but it's definitely an improvement. I'll have to do some reference studies of hands sometime if I want to really build up my visual library for these details properly. Anyway, more overly exposed bright light and rim lighting on some of these other hands, and I'm pretty much ready to call this painting done for now. Just remember to put a line of hard saturation between any direct lighting area and the rest of the skin. That's a detail you don't want to miss. It will sell the lighting a lot more. Well, I hope you enjoyed the painting and the whole video for that matter. We're coming to the close, and the only thing left to do is tag on some little animation here at the end. So here you go! Amazing, I know. Actually, I don't know. I'm recording this audio before I got a chance to make the animation. Well, I'm sure it was just the greatest thing ever. Okay, I want to give a big thank you to everyone for watching this video, and an even bigger thank you to all of my wonderful patrons for keeping this channel going. You guys are great. And as always, the drawing and painting in this video was all done using Corel Painter. Feel free to go browse the channel if you want to find more videos about my digital painting methods and whatever else. Alright, see ya everyone.